Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Fabric first seems to be the mantra these days, and it's a shame it wasn't 50 years ago. But Max Fordham, who sadly died last year, had this ambition. He told me about this in the 80s. And he finally did it in his own house, but unfortunately only lived in it for 2 or 3 years, which actually got the very first net zero certification last year by the UK Green Building Council. Now, how much does this sort of thinking apply to existing buildings? Sadly, Hellman, the architectural cartoonist, sort of captures it all nearly 50 years ago in this case, saying, why have we been building gas guzzlers when traditional buildings could teach us an awful lot? And we've now had nearly 50 years more gas guzzlers, unfortunately. Now, if we want to, I sometimes give a talk a bit like this called Retrofit Our Buildings or Our Brains, but I thought that was a bit, facetious for you, so I decided not to. But essentially, we may need to change the whole mindset in which we approach buildings. So on the train over here, I thought, well, actually, I wouldn't mind recapitulating just a few bullet points from how my mindset's changed about retrofit over the last half century. Because we've got a number of light bulb moments. After the energy crisis, nearly 50 years ago now, coming up, we found a lot of buildings didn't get tuned up, and there are a lot of really simple things you could do. Then I got involved in historic buildings and cathedrals and things like that and did some monitoring, and moisture came really up the scale in terms of the performance. And I also started looking at non-domestic retrofit and finding enormous differences between what the designers anticipated and what was being built and how it was performing. And also, even though sometimes you had facilities management companies coming up saying, oh yes, we know about all the energy, they hadn't even seen an energy bill. And the trouble is, it's often still like that. Most domestic people I talk about don't realize that their monthly energy bill has a summary of annual consumption on it. They haven't even got that far. So I wrote a paper actually in 2000 called Flying Blind. And nearly 25 years later, we still are, because there is very little appreciation, understanding, and management of what really happens in buildings. If you look at it, you find, for the most part, the new ones perform worse than you expected, and the traditional ones perform better than you expected. So there are enormous things in our knowledge base that need looking at. And procurement tends to be dreadful. That's where passive houses really had a breakthrough, because it is a quality standard which is applied on top of the energy standard. Now, interestingly, I got called into Singapore about 30 years ago where they were mandating improvements in the fabric of some of their office buildings. And the energy consumption in some of these went up, so the developers were really complaining. Because unless you have a whole building approach, if the services and the fabric and the controls and the people aren't properly integrated, it will fall over. And then I got involved about 25 years ago in traditional domestic retrofit. I did some studies for English heritage to start with. We did some case studies. And it was really interesting because owner-occupiers often cut corners and got good results. And social landlords spent a lot of money on doing complicated things. They weren't done very well sometimes. They weren't very fragile. They were a bit fragile. They couldn't afford to look after them, and they fell over. So we got a difficult thing. You could spend a little bit of money well and a lot of money badly. And then the domestic Green Deal came along, which was terrible, because it was just a shopping list of add-on energy-saving measures. It took no account of ventilation, it took no account of moisture, it took no account of state and condition. So we worked with Neil May and others on what became the Sustainable Traditional Buildings Alliance, which launched this report 10 years ago on responsible retrofit for traditional buildings. It was looking at the knowledge base that clients and designers and managers and policymakers use to pilot retrofit. And the conclusions were a bit disappointing in terms of lack of understanding. Now, I'm just working for my sins. I said I wouldn't get involved when I was first invited on the Heritage Group for the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard. There are an awful lot of people who don't know much about existing buildings. So, and lots of people now rely on software more and more. And if there's something wrong, it must be something wrong with the people and not something wrong with the software. Often, this stuff isn't user-friendly. In fact, I have a sort of law of people and buildings. Some people think they're vandals. Some people think they're idiots. Some people think they're random variations, but they can actually be intelligent participants. But not a lot of people know that. But you really need to, because bottom-up works really well. So we developed this guidance wheel thing, which essentially was a risk management saying, if you're going to have a shopping list, you take care. If you seal up the windows, you may have a moisture problem. If you have a moisture problem, you may need ventilation, but there may also be cold bridges, blah, blah, blah. So even though we piloted this on grandmothers in North Yorkshire, people say it's too complicated. And actually it is probably too complicated because if you take a whole building approach and you're managing the risks to start with, you don't have nasty things popping out of the floor when you don't expect it, which you certainly got with the green subprime deal. Then I've had some recent light bulb moments, particularly working on PAS 2038 committee, which is a sort of non-domestic version of PAS 2035. And BSI initially thought, non-domestic buildings were like large houses. They're not. You have to take a completely different approach to this. And this was like herding cats trying to push back on PAS 2038. So as with always with laws and standards, ended up as a bit of a camel, but at least it wasn't big-size PAS 2035. And PAS 2038 assumes you have a professional team there in the first place. But we've done some thinking in operation. Certain people have been using PAS 2038. Certainly we did a blind test on PAS 2035 and a retrofit plan. And they don't necessarily really work very well because the briefing exercise has not been done carefully enough. Particularly, again, for the owner-occupiers who can take shortcuts. But if I give you an example, we had a retrofit plan done on a house down the road. It's a 4-story house in a conservation area. The initial proposal said replace all the windows at the front. Was that really necessary? No, so it went to secondary glazing at the front, was rather better. But then it did some other things which were stupid. All the houses near had put an extra floor on. The owner was only going to be there for another 5 or 10 years. She was in her 70s. Anybody who bought it would either clean it out and turn it into a luxury house, or they divide it up into flats, they put another floor on. So you don't do an expensive insulation roof job and put PV panels on top of it. No sense. So we got the £100,000 down to £50,000 and finally down to £10,000 for a greater energy saving, but it didn't have some of the carbon saving technologies. Owner-occupiers, social landlords and private lands have very different priorities. Social landlords generally have to do something they hope will be fit and forget, but then, as I say, often the pudding's over-egged and they can't afford to look after it. Private landlords in the luxury market may be fine, but the smaller private domestic landlords are actually going to be late adopters. It seems to me that the social landlords and the owner-occupiers with a bit of money have got to build capacity in the supply chains. And then once you've got the capacity in the supply chains, things can be more efficient, more trusted, more cost-effective, and then they can go on to otherwise. The other thing we found is most owner-occupiers proceed incrementally. I mean, some people have big pockets and they buy a house and they strip it out and they do an Retrofit, but most don't. And that's actually quite a good idea, because if you're buying a house, you don't really understand its potential. Once you've lived in it, you suddenly have a different, we don't want the kitchen there, and it'd be nice to do that. No, I've heard about this Energiesprong thing. Why don't we sort of extend the whole of the back and cover it up? So, essentially incremental is often good, and incremental can get you quick savings fast, but what you need is a plan to make sure you don't box yourself into a corner, because we don't want blind alleys, because we're going to waste money, we're going to waste materials. That's not going to be sustainable, because so often stuff gets done. I mean, this is a big problem with minimum energy efficiency standards. I mean, one, they're rubbish because energy performance certificates are rubbish. But landlords who go for it will normally do a cheap job. So when somebody comes along and knows what they want and gets somebody who knows what they're talking about, often a lot of the cheap job will go on the skip. Not sustainable. We really need to keep things simple, do them well, make them last, do it deliberately. And another issue is conservation officer says no. In our area, it just stops people doing things. A colleague of mine tried to put a heat pump in his building. There was absolutely no problem, but it's got vetoed. Various other things. So that needs to be lubricated. Fortunately, on the Heritage Group, we are in touch with all the heritage bodies who sit on the committee too. So essentially quite a lot is trying to happen to influence planning policy there. But the trouble is, conservation officers go offline. So essentially a proposal goes in, it's sent to the conservation officer for their view, it comes back, and then the planners treat that as gospel. That we need much more of a dialogue, and we also need much more of a boilerplate for a particular area, saying, what would make sense in the contract? Why do you need an awful lot of drawings when all you need is a photograph with a sketch on top of it to give an idea of what's going to happen? And a lot of traditional buildings and existing buildings have been messed up. People have done the wrong thing. They put on hard renders, they put in horribly proportioned windows, blah, blah, blah. You can put that right at the same time. So there's an opportunity for, overall enhancing of the significance of the building and the meaning of a building in a community if we can put it to a state which looks more comfortable within the area and with its neighbours. And government always tries to do things at a big scale, top down with corporates. Doesn't work. The corporates can provide the goods, services and equipment that might be needed, but it needs to be sucked in from the bottom up. That's the only way we're going to get retrofits which are suited to the context in which they find themselves. So it's a tricky one, because essentially you don't get here by throwing a lot of money at it immediately. What you do get there is throwing as much money as it needs as quickly as it can be. And then you don't grow linearly, you grow exponentially. And you can really get a long way in a medium amount of time without falling over, because you share the knowledge while you're doing it. You build up the skills. If you know the particular window patterns, you can make those in a coir or whatever in your local workshop, which will suit the whole of that terrace when they get round to it, etc. So, this was in Charlotte Square. I thought I must take a photograph of that. Fabric first for existing buildings. There's been a bit of, the passive house zealots tend to go there, and it's all Retrofit, etc. But, one, we've got a lot of legacy where, unfortunately, most designers didn't do fabric first. We're very, very poor on environmental design, and we still are, particularly in relation to overheating, where often window design and services design is crass in many modern houses. And also, there are aesthetic tripwires, there are technical tripwires, there are moisture tripwires, there's the opportunity of destructive interventions, and please think what happens in a flood, because often what you put on in a retrofit all has to come off again. So robust buildings is the name of future sustainability. And so in our heritage group of a net zero carbon standard, we've said fabric first means good maintenance, but for heaven's sake, think about it first. But often one's found, again, particularly with the green subprime deal, that people were clapping insulation onto damp walls and things like that. Not clever, has to be reversed. In the worst cases, a wall falls down or the building has to be knocked down. So fabric first is great, but essentially you've got a multiplier effect. You want to halve the demand by various measures. And that isn't only with the fabric, it's saying, do we really need this? Then you can increase the efficiency of the kit, and then you can take carbon out of the supplies. So as Tesco says, every little helps. And so if you just get halfway on each of those, your footprint's down to an eighth. And by the time you've got there, the electricity network can do quite a lot for you, and heat pumps can do quite a lot for you, and there's lots of things you can do about that. And in fact, what we're finding a little bit in Heritage Group is some portfolio owners with Heritage, they got the heat pump get out of jail free card. And let's just bang a heat pump, and that's great, isn't it? But of course it isn't. You really need to try and get the demands down first. And if everybody starts having heat pumps, there is going to be death to the electrical infrastructure. And also, with renewable energy, we've got this enormous bottleneck on the storage. And it isn't going to be all batteries, and it isn't all going to be pumped hydro, and it isn't all going to be hydrogen. We need a greater portfolio of things that get us through the German Dunkelflaute, which is when there ain't no sun and there ain't no wind, what do? So, on to a spectrum of approaches. So I don't know whether you can read this here. I'm sorry that the sun's shining on this. Pity there isn't a blind in a strategic position. Anyway, never mind. So, deep retrofit tends to have been the mantra. It's great if you can do it, but it's going to be a bit of a niche, in my view. Good practice, you're spending about half as much, perhaps £50,000 per unit. You do a reduced set of measures, but it's still rather a lot. On a 30-year time horizon, perhaps, but on a 10-year time horizon, no. Letty has been thinking about London Energy Transformation Initiative, has been thinking about sort of cost-effective on the good practice. Don't do the bits that are difficult. If the front wall has got complex detailing, forget it. The side wall will do. That's hardly got any windows in it. But of course, you can't quite forget the front wall, because if you up the glazing, you might find a bit of condensation on the window reveals and mold, which wouldn't be very clever. So how about slapping a bit of structural foam plastic over that? Let's forget about all this sophisticated aerogels or not. What can we, well, that might catch fire, mightn't it? So essentially they're still thinking about that. Because what they hope, and by the way, if we can do the Pareto optimum on this, we might be able to have MVHR and a heat pump, but it's going to have to be, £300 MVHR and a £3,000 heat pump, not the sort of thing we have, install £3,000 heat pump. So they're looking very much at what you can do as a drop-in replacement for a combi boiler with a heat pump. So it doesn't take up any more footprint, because that's the big problem. And then we've got what I've been working on a bit on the heritage stuff, is a soft retrofit. You don't work in from the fabric, you work out from the people. And what you're trying to do is not provide a super comfort level, you want to provide a healthy survival level and avoid unpleasant discomfort. And I'll go through a few things one can do that. And then there's the basic energy saving stuff that can often be very rapid, very cost-effective, very useful, but tends to get missed out in things like a PAS 2035 retrofit plan. It shouldn't be, but it's difficult to get people who can give that advice at a high enough quality level. But again, quite a lot of it is generic, so you could tailor this to the locality with sort of barefoot doctors or whatever. And it's probably better to do that than to try and expand the set of the retrofit plan. There seems to be a very big difference between an energy survey and a retrofit plan. Like it or not, there seem to be very different mindsets there. So, let's talk about the soft retrofit time. How can we be healthy and comfortable enough while we save energy in a hurry, we don't come up against various capacity limitations? Because what we expect for comfort is much more variable than you might think. And you can find that out instantly by talking to people in the global south, etc. But surveys have been done by Ferguson, Nicolette, al. There's lots and lots to say that people can put up with a much better range of conditions than you might think. But you need to be careful on the fabric first side that you don't hit a moisture and health button at the low end, and obviously you can't hit a heat exhaustion thing at the high end. So how have we got to the thought of standards we now take for granted but are a bit questionable? There's a clearer archive of what happened in the States, where there was a fight 20 years ago, almost to the day, between the physicians who wanted natural ventilation and the engineers who wanted mechanical ventilation and cooling. And this journal was set up about 10 years later, where the idea was to get out the depression, you needed to sell heating and air conditioning systems. And suddenly, this is a book by Gail Cooper called Air Conditioning America. If engineering standards for controlled climates were the norm, then all of a sudden you had a market for mechanical energy-consuming kit absolutely everywhere, whether you needed it or not. And then the next stage, of course, was to seal buildings up, so you were totally dependent on it. And all the passive features went away, because that made the air conditioning affordable. And anyway, after the war in the States, the Americans liked to sell more stuff and more energy, because this was part of the Cold War with the Russians. And it's interesting because in the constitution of ASHVE, that became ASHRAE, of the American Society of Heating Engineers, they wanted to establish a clearly defined standard. They wanted to favor legislation compelling ventilation in all public buildings. They wanted to encourage legislation favorable to improvement in the arts of heating and ventilation. Well, that's not too bad, really, but look at the humdinger. To oppose the legislation inimitable to the business of the services engineer. Aha! And they've just republished it in something called Proclaiming the Truth. Believe it or not, it was earlier. Proclaiming the Truth. These things are questionable, particularly in a climate emergency, energy sufficiency, climate justice, migration, you name it. What we're used to, we're not necessarily entitled to, and may be highly questionable. So let's have a look at what we might do to live with our means with energy sufficiency. We need to promote adaptive comfort. It's not 22 plus or minus 2. It's certainly plus or minus 5 or so. You want to stop adverse effects. People can't define comfort any well anyway. It's a complete myth. But when you're uncomfortable, and if you have a crisis of discomfort, you jolly well don't want to be there. And if you know your building takes you from time to time into crises of discomfort, you will be more picky about the building. So if the building doesn't keep you in the safe territory, comes too tight, you get uncomfortable one way or other, then you get more and more picky in the limits come. So you still find the European standards, for heating, ventilation, air conditioning limits, the more the better, the tighter the better. Not necessarily. Radiation can be important, both in and out. Clothing can be important. But also there are things like local and personal cooling systems and heating systems, which can be really useful. I mean, I get by satisfactorily with 15 in my office with an electric heated cushion on my chair, which I press the button on for 10 seconds occasionally. I'm now convinced my wife that she should have one too, but she likes 17. So controls have to be accessible, responsive, and user-friendly, because otherwise people don't understand. The trouble is, with controls, the technology usually runs ahead of the usability. And we've been working with physiologists at Maastricht, and guess what? It's use it or lose it. If people don't live in a fluctuating thermal environment, they get less healthy. Even quite unhealthy ones. I mean, not all of them are medical conditions, but there are actually positive advantages of not living in a completely stable environment. Now, for the talk in Edinburgh last year, which is on our website, I have expand each of those 7 points. So you can look at that on usablebuildings.co.uk if you want to. I've got a reserve of slides here if anybody wants to look at them in privacy, but I won't show them now. But of course, all this, health comes first. So one needs to be careful not to fall off that envelope. But one of the ways may be thermal refuges, that essentially you might have a public one, as they had in the heat dome in Canada last year, but also you can have private ones of understanding the topography of your building and making sure there's a good place to be when it's where it's cold and a good place to be where it's hot. So you don't necessarily have to do the whole thing in the extreme condition, but you can keep people safe and healthy. And you can do this quickly. May only be a stepping stone, but the interesting thing is people who've tried it have found I don't need to heat my building so much anymore. I've got a couple of people who bought Victorian houses, architects who wanted to do an Enefit. They say, we don't need to do an Enefit. We've been trying personal heating and things over the last couple of years. Our teenage children don't like it so much, though. So I won't go through this because I've only got 5 minutes to go, I think. But essentially, there are lots of useful things if you relax a bit on the comfort conditions. But what I would like to talk about is a sort of mindset for moving into the future. Because, in a sort of distant past, but unfortunately also in Russia and lots of other places, there's often a strong man or a priesthood that tells people what to do, and that's it, and they get on with what they can outside the system to the extent possible, as I found when I visited Iran a few years ago. We're now very much in the sort of death of the consumer economy, in my view, where, the market's invisible hand has been found to be either stuck in the pocket or, taking it out and throwing it into the environment. But unfortunately, corporate takeover is endemic, and we haven't got enough bottom-up capacity at the moment. And that's going to need to change, in my view. So the future, we're less about consumer and more into citizen and community, where out of priesthoods, out of markets, into collaboratives. So, those of you who are professionals need to work much closer with the communities you're serving. You can't just hide behind your expertise anymore. The expertise lies widely down. But you have to be very careful to have a bullshit detector for fake news. And so buildings, they were built to last except for the ones that weren't. Of course, that's a nice thing about traditional historic buildings. They're sustainable because they're still with us. So don't mess it up and turn them from a long-lived product into a short-lived product. So we need to be much, much more imaginative reuse. Bill Getting, who is chair of the RIBA Sustainability Committee in the noughties, said, in the future, a new building should be a privilege. I think we really need to think that way. And so energy's gone from conservation to efficiency to now sufficiency. You know, how little can we get away with and still have a good lifestyle? Preferably a better one, because you're not on the treadmill all the time. You're actually having a good quality of life. And even Macron's picked it up. You know, we're living at the age of abundance. How do we make really good use of what we've got? So, that's just a summary of that, but you can look at that later. Now, I'd just like to finish with Donella Meadows. Work with the people who are interested, do it bottom up. As Donella Meadows said, you know, there are people who want to work with you on doing sensible things. There are lots of people who want to listen and do it too once the word's got about, and forget the others. So here was the UK Green Building Council Net Zero Whole Life Carbon Roadmap a couple of years ago, and this is what it said. We can't look at behaviour change. We've got to do fabric first. I don't think so, except to the view I've described fabric first. You know, get rid of the nonsenses, make sure it's well maintained, do sensible things. But don't necessarily take it too far, because too far can be risky, it can be expensive, it's probably unnecessary in most cases. Thank you very much.